Hello, everybody. This is Debbie Fox. I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm just so glad that you all joined us here today with our ongoing DV Housing and Technical Assistance COVID-19 special topic series. Today, we're going to be talking about responding to the eviction crisis and the eviction cliff. As you know, and we're hearing in the news and from Congress, we're at the precipice of the eviction moratorium lifting from the federal perspective. Many states have eviction protections that they have extended, but we're going to be talking today about both the federal response and then what's happening at the state and local levels. We have Renee Williams with us from the National Housing Law Project, Christina Contreras-Fox from the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, and then we have Shannon Ray from a local program in Washington State called Solid Ground. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I work with the National Network to End Domestic Violence. I'm the Senior Housing Policy and Practice Specialist here, and we are, I think next slide please. And we also will have our DV Housing Consortium partners from Collaborative Solutions answering questions in the chat box, and that's Jill will be answering and Sheena from Collaborative Solutions. So just to give a quick overview for those that have joined us, you know this spiel, but any new folks, we are part of a DV Housing Consortium that's very unique and innovative. We've been around for a number of years, and we're funded through federal partners from HHS, the Department of Justice, and HUD, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Violence. So you can see our federal partners there that support our work. And then we're part of a collaborative of a number of technical assistance providers to be able to provide support, TA and training to the field that includes the National Alliance for Safe Housing, Collaborative Solutions, the organization I'm with, the National Network. We also have the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, along with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, which is also a HUD TA provider along with Collaborative Solutions. Next slide, please. So recently, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence put together a infographic that looks at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence, housing and homelessness, and racism in those intersections. So it's been very timely as we center our work and all that we're doing to center racism and looking at the historical inequities and historical trauma that has been part of the housing response in our country. So I would like to go ahead and play that for you before we go into the further presentations.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thank you for sharing that infographic and our CDV and creating that. And we encourage you all in this virtual time and space when we're doing COVID-related work that this is a tool you can definitely use when you're doing housing work, and a lot of us shape policy and work with our continuums of care and work doing housing related policy work. So this is something you can use in terms of how we're framing the conversations around how racism is perpetuated in our housing systems and why it's necessary to center women and women of color in particular, and those who have multiple identities, LGBTQI folks and gender nonconforming folks. That these are places where we really need to be thinking about how we're prioritizing those who have experienced historical discrimination in housing. And so we also wanted to center the overview of the historical context in housing, but then also talk about the particular time we're in with COVID-19, housing and racial equity. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we know in our work and in our communities and amongst communities of color, that Black people are dying at rates that are higher than the other populations in our country. We know there's many reasons for that in terms of how there has been historical discrimination in housing, low wage jobs, and workers and essential workers are often women of color in the workforce. So there's a lot more exposure to COVID-19. There's also concerns around the impact of COVID-19 on Native American communities. And also there's a lot of concerns around data around those data sets with Native Americans and how those are being tracked. And there's often disparate rates of infection and death in those communities. And then there's also research tied to COVID-19 and housing and racial inequity that ties the racial residential segregation as a fundamental cause of the health disparities in general and also during COVID. Next slide, please. And we also know that there are just particular challenges in communities that have been historically marginalized and underfunded, and then there's been redlining in those communities, that there's been specific lack of funding and initiatives to keep communities thriving. And so there's a lot of challenges in terms of food deserts and lack of medical facilities and historical discrimination. So there's a lot of additional challenges for rural communities and communities of color that have lack of facilities and services to adequately respond to the COVID-19 crisis right now. So we just want to make sure that that's an overlay and overview as we're thinking about this work. And then in particular today, we're going to be learning about the eviction crisis that's looming, and definitely as we know, and we'll learn more about today, that it's disproportionately will impact communities of color and Black Native communities, particularly even more than other communities. And so we're trying to figure out and think of ways that we can respond in real time, and then also shape policy and work with those in our communities that have leadership making decisions, and those in state and federal government to be able to support our neighbors that we want to keep safely housed during this very unprecedented time. So I'm going to pass it over to Renee Williams at the National Housing Law Project. And so we're going to go from the federal to the state to the local level, and then we'll have time at the end, hopefully 15 minutes or so, to have question and answers. And then also I encourage you to say hello in the chat box, and then what else? And yeah, ask questions there, say hello. And then I also forgot to mention that this is being recorded. So the webinar will be recorded so you can listen to it again or share with your colleagues. And we'll be sending that out in the next few days. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Renee. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Thank you, and thank you to Jenny and everyone with the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium for having this webinar today, and to everyone in the audience for all the work that you're doing on behalf of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. As Debbie said, my name's Renee Williams. I am a senior staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project. Just a quick note, we don't have a lot of time today and we have a lot to cover, but I just wanted to mention my organization, NHLP, National Housing Law Project. We are a national support center that provides training and technical assistance on housing issues confronting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and we provide that assistance to advocates, legal services, attorneys across the country. My email is on the slide, and there's a lot of information that I'm going to go through today, so please feel free to reach out afterwards if you have questions. So, and I'm just going to talk today. I don't have slides with content prepared, but again, if you have clarifying questions, we can take them at the end, or you can reach out. So just a quick roadmap for us today. So first, we're going to talk, just to center our discussion, we're going to talk about the eviction moratoriums. You know, Debbie mentioned state moratoriums, federal moratoriums. So I'm just going to give a general overview with a focus on the federal perspective, but also, you know, state moratoria are also relevant here as well. Where we are in terms of the process, for those of you who are following the news, you've probably seen stories about the federal eviction moratorium expiring, so we're going to get into that. And then what lies ahead, and some considerations you should be thinking about, you know, as you start seeing clients who are being evicted because of the end of the moratorium. So, you know, we are, and this is the reason we have this webinar today, we're on the cusp of an acute evictions crisis in this country. There was an eviction crisis before the pandemic. And, you know, everything that Debbie said was true about, you know, our structural inequities that we have in this country, specifically with respect to race, but also, you know, with respect to people with disabilities and other identities, and, you know, a lot of barriers for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. But this eviction moratorium, and I'm sorry, the pandemic, which is the reason why we have these eviction moratoriums, the pandemic has really sort of exposed a lot of these vulnerabilities that families have, right? And just how much of people's income is going to rent each month, as well as how little of a buffer there is for families. And so, you know, we're staring down this pretty acute crisis. So just to give you a snapshot of what we're up against, so yesterday, Reuters published an article that cites an estimate that renters in the US owe about $21.5 billion in past due rent. And, you know, we'll talk about this later, but, you know, these moratoriums that are in place, these eviction moratoriums, did not forgive unpaid rent. So going forward, tenants are still vulnerable to eviction. This is also coupled with the ending of the $600 employment benefit that folks have been relying on. Right now, there's not really any certainty as to what assistance for folks who have lost their jobs is going to be available. So we're really up against a perfect storm. You know, recently the U.S. Census Bureau did a survey for the week ending July 21st. And in that survey, 9.8 million people said they had, quote, no confidence, end quote, in their ability to pay rent. And another 14 million said that they only had slight confidence. So this is really what we're up against. And as Debbie mentioned, and I wanted to stress, you know, not unexpectedly, just because we're really seeing, everything really just being exacerbated by the pandemic, people of color are being significantly negatively impacted. Of that no confidence in be able to pay rent group, of 9.8 million, nearly 3.9 million of those folks who responded that they had no confidence are Hispanic and Latinx, and over 2 million are Black. So, of that 9.8 million, you see the percentage of folks who are just really on the edge here of being vulnerable to eviction. And even before the pandemic, survivors of domestic violence, particularly survivors of color, were vulnerable to eviction, as you all know. For folks who have maybe read Matthew Desmond's work on evictions, one of the groups that he, in his work, has really highlighted is the eviction of Black women who are survivors of domestic violence. So I'm just going to quickly talk about eviction moratoriums. Again, don't have a ton of time, but I just kind of want to center where we are. So an eviction moratorium is basically a pause, right, on evictions, such that people can't, be removed from their homes during the moratorium. And so it basically means you can't be forced to leave during some period of time during the pandemic. And we have sort of two flavors of moratoriums. And, on this call, early on in the pandemic, we did a separate call that really breaks down what the eviction moratorium is and all the nuts and bolts. But basically what you need to know for now is that, you have the federal eviction moratorium under the CARES Act, which prohibits landlords basically between March 27th, when the act was signed into law, and through July 24th, so just ended. During that time, landlords could not file an eviction action in court. And after that, so we're past that point now. Landlords can start providing eviction notices to tenants. And this is an important point. So the eviction moratorium ended on July 24th, last week. Right now, what we're in is the 30-day notice period, meaning that if a housing provider at the very end, at the first possible opportunity for tenants who are covered by the CARES Act, provided a notice of eviction, that tenant still has 30 days before an eviction action can actually be filed. So, we're talking about next month where we're really going to start to see the consequences, of the moratorium expiring. So, it does not mean that a tenant is going to be out on the street today or, right after the moratorium expired. So I just want people to know that important point. So that 30-day notice period still applies. For any eviction, that's related to, for example, non-payment of rent between March 27th and July 24th. There are arguments, and I don't want to get too much into the technical details, but, there are arguments about, there are additional arguments that the 30-day notice may apply in other cases beyond non-payment of rent, but that is not necessarily set in stone. And so, definitely talk to an attorney and a landlord-tenant lawyer who would know, how to sort of best assert those protections. So the Federal CARES Act, and I'm just gonna, like I said, provide a brief snapshot of coverage just so we can kind of get to what to do going forward. So the CARES Act basically says landlords between that March 27th and July 24th period, you can't serve an eviction notice to tenants. You can't charge fees, penalties, or other charges related to non-payment of rent. And that continues after the moratorium is over for that time period, meaning that landlords, if somebody is behind on their rent, they shouldn't be assessing fees after the fact for late rent. Say you missed your April rent or you were late there should not be sort of fees after the fact for the missed rent in April. So, and again, you know, there's a lot of contours here, but if you have questions about what you're seeing, please reach out. The important part about the federal moratorium is that it covers basically federally subsidized and assisted housing programs that are also covered by VAWA 2013. So these are units that for survivors who are low income, you know, these are units that survivors are living in, Section 8 vouchers, public housing, low income housing tax credit, et cetera. They're also in the instance of federally backed mortgages. You know, if a landlord is getting relief for mortgage payments, as in a forbearance, tenants are entitled to protections from eviction while the landlord is not making payments on their federally backed mortgage. And then even after the forbearance period, there's certain tenant protections in place while the owner is getting current on their back mortgage payments. All of this is to say, one of the things that you should do, and then if it's okay with folks, I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes going through what folks should be thinking about in terms of moving forward. But what I will say is that one thing you definitely want to do is see, you know, if you have clients, you want to see whether or not they are covered by the CARES Act moratoriums and what that means. You definitely want to talk to a lawyer, a landlord tenant attorney who can tell you what your client's options are. And if you're an attorney and you're trying to figure this out, please reach out to National Housing Law Project. And of course, advocates can reach out to us as well, and we can kind of talk you through that. Because rent is due. Oh, and I will just say, and I think my co-presenters are going to talk about sort of state and local moratoriums. Just know that that's an additional layer that you want to think about. You know, is your client covered by the federal moratorium? Is there a state or local moratorium that is in place that may be more protective than the federal moratorium? So, you know, again, you want to talk to a landlord tenant lawyer in your state if you're starting to see people who are concerned about evictions who are behind on their rent. Unfortunately, rent is still due. You know, just because there was a pause, there was not rent forgiveness. So, you know, I think here are a few general tips. And again, you know, we're happy to work with advocates who are working with clients. But, you know, one really particularly important thing, if you get nothing else from this webinar, at least from my end, if your client receives an eviction notice, they should consult a housing attorney immediately to discuss their rights and options. So, you know, just so that they are not, they don't end up in a position where they could have asserted rights or they could have worked it out and are ending up in a worse position. So please, please, please reach out to a housing attorney where you're located. Secondly, if you are working with clients who are federally assisted, say they have a Section 8 voucher, they live in public housing, folks who are in a lot of these federal housing programs are entitled to an interim income recertification, meaning that if you lost income because of the pandemic, you can go to your housing authority and say, I lost income because of the pandemic. I want my rent to be recalculated so that, you know, moving forward, I pay less in rent. And so that will help ease the rent burden going forward. A couple of other just really important points to note about repayment plans. And this applies both for folks who are living in federally assisted housing as well as folks who live on the private market. And the private market is really going to govern a lot of, is going to be governed by the state and local moratorium, not the CARES Act. For those folks who are looking at repayment plans to pay off rental arrears, again, tenants, if at all possible, should talk to a lawyer before signing anything. There is not necessarily going to be, you know, you're not on equal negotiating terms, particularly when you're housing at stake and particularly if you're a survivor. So there's just a lot of, there are a lot of dynamics at play. You want to make sure that you know, your client is being set up to succeed and that they're not basically setting themselves up to just get evicted down the line. Avoid lump sum payments. So, you know, really should be watching and making sure that tenants are not being required to pay all of their rental arrears up front. So, you know, next month, if you're $2,000 behind on rent, somehow you're going to have to come up with $2,000 in rent. You want to make sure that future rent payments, if a tenant is in the unit, are applied to rent first, and then any back rent owed, because you don't want to set up a situation where somebody can be evicted for being behind going forward, even if there is a repayment plan in place. Very important, you want to try and include a provision that the owner will work with the tenant to obtain any rental assistance that may come available. Things are happening really quickly at the national level, the state and local levels. And like I said, my colleagues are going to talk about those pieces. But if you're working out a repayment plan, try to get that provision in there so that the owner is, you know, and they should be incentivized to do so, because it's a quick way for them to get some of these rental arrears back. But just try to make sure that the owner will commit to working with the tenant to apply for any rental assistance that may be available. Again, making sure that your client is not set up to fail in the repayment plan process, so that you're not paying 70, 80, 85% of your income in rent when you include the rent going forward and the rental arrears. You know, obviously, people should not be paying more than 30% of their income in rent, but we know that's not realistic in terms of what actually happens. And so people were already paying 60% of their income in rent pre-pandemic. So just factor that in and make sure that folks are able to stay. Watch out for hidden fees and charges. And then just a frank examination of, am I going to be able to afford rent in this unit going forward? Or do I need to try and work out an arrangement where I can move somewhere else? Of course, that brings up its own considerations. And just one other final note, because we're talking about survivors of domestic and sexual violence, just know that valid protections with respect to housing, federally assisted housing programs still apply. So survivors should not be being evicted because of the actions of their abuser or because of the violence committed against them. And there are arguments that you can make. And if you want to know more about that, please let me know. If you're in private housing, there may be fair housing or other state or local law arguments that you can make. So reach out to us and we can kind of talk through strategy. And I know I'm like way over time. I packed in a lot, but I hope it was useful. And please, again, my email is on the screen. Please reach out. And I'm going to pass it off. I don't remember who's actually next. Christina, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to assume you can hear me. If you hear a long silence and someone says something, I know there's something wrong with my audio. But anyway, I'm going to press ahead. So my name is Cristina Contreras Fox. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless. Excuse me. So the Coalition for the Homeless is a statewide nonprofit, and we work to prevent and end homelessness in Rhode Island. We anchor much of the homelessness system in the state. For example, we're the state lead for the homeless management information system. We also co-run our coordinated entry system along with Crossroads Rhode Island. We don't provide direct services such as shelter or supportive services like case management, but we do a lot of work in systems transformation, and we provide a lot of support to our partners who are providing direct service like shelter or supportive services, et cetera. But we also recognize that ending homelessness will require systemic change. So policy and advocacy and really organizing, grassroots organizing, is a big pillar of our work. And it's through these two buckets that we've been most engaged with responding to the eviction crisis in Rhode Island, in particular during this moment of COVID-19. Excuse me. So we know domestic violence and evictions are two very, very common causes of homelessness, often paired together, right? Excuse me. And the current pandemic has only made this worse. Far from being the great equalizer, COVID has just exacerbated these already crisis situations in our state. So according to the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, this past June, there was a 42% increase in calls to the helpline and hotlines, 42% up from June of last year. And we know the folks making those calls, they need help, they need protection, they need resources. And they have lost virtually all of, well, at this point, all state and federal level protections against eviction. So as it's been mentioned, the protections that existed under the CARES Act expired on the 24th. The coalition, most of our advocacy work is focused at the state level, particularly at our General Assembly, excuse me, but we've also been advocating really fiercely with national partners like the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the National Alliance to End Homelessness to win really important investments at the federal level in housing and homelessness. In particular, in the HEROES Act, we've been very supportive of $11.5 billion investment in emergency solutions grant funding, $100 billion in rental assistance, and also a year-long uniform national moratorium on eviction and foreclosure. So these are all things that are currently being debated by Congress right now. So if you want to take some strong action, I encourage you to call your members of Congress and ask them to support these really important items, especially that $100 billion in rental assistance and the national year-long moratorium on foreclosure and eviction. Because those are two critical pieces that we need in order to address these challenges, these crises really, both in Rhode Island, but across the country in every part. Excuse me. But we need more. So while we're waiting on see what happens on the federal level, it's clear we need more protections at the state level in Rhode Island. So to give you some context about our state and evictions, excuse me, Rhode Island might not come to the top of your list when you think about places with high levels of eviction, but our eviction rate is actually higher than the national average. It's the highest in New England. Providence's eviction rate is 3 times higher than that of Boston. So many people have heard the phrase eviction tsunami. In Rhode Island, it's really like a tsunami happening during a Category 5 hurricane. Excuse me. So evictions have been processing in Rhode Island for essentially 2 months. They started again on the 1st of June. There was a pause from the middle of March, the 17th, to the end of May. But this was thanks to an executive order from the Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court. This was not done by executive order through our governor, so it's not a true moratorium. Excuse me. This just happened because the judiciary sent an executive order closing the courts. So other protections like not charging late fees or not allowing landlords to charge interest on late payment, et cetera, those were not included. So our moratorium, when it happened, the protection was very piecemeal because, like I said, it happened by virtue of the court's closing, not by an intentional executive order to establish eviction protections. Excuse me. And so this is one of the biggest lessons that we learned through that is the importance of making sure that we are, as advocates, we can be nimble and ensure that we are advocating comprehensively for what protections are necessary, because it's not always just enough to say close the courts or we want a moratorium. Like, it's important to be, when you're advocating with these policymakers who are the ones ultimately that decide, do we have a moratorium or not, being specific and covering all bases and highlighting all of these different pieces is very, very important. Because otherwise you can end up being in a place where you're very reactive and you are sort of having to advocate piecemeal. Like, for example, notices could still be sent for evictions, and even after the courts were closed, there were still constables who were serving people with eviction notices in the middle of a pandemic, which is obviously very bad, and it's very traumatic. Don't want those kinds of things to happen. And so we advocated and won that protection. We had an order from our Department of Business Regulations instructing constables not to carry out these orders, and also providing a contact for people to report. If I see a constable going and serving someone and trying to carry out an eviction, I know I can call this person and they will handle it. Excuse me. So we are seeing a rise in evictions in Rhode Island. There were literally, I mean, from when evictions first started happening again on the 1st of June, there were hundreds of cases that were ready to go for day one. We're seeing that number just rise because, so our eviction, we're all, imagine whenever we say moratorium now, it's in quotes, our universal moratorium in Rhode Island ended on the 1st, but there was still protections for folks until July 1st for what was called COVID-related evictions. So if somebody was being evicted during that period of court closure from the 17th to the 1st, so they were being evicted due to COVID, they could not, their case couldn't process until starting July 1st. So since that's all gone now, and we're seeing a rise in evictions, and it is absolutely extremely troublesome. Now, as for next steps, what we're looking at as advocates and as folks who care about this and want to make an impact, we want to make sure that the changes that we're pushing, the policy changes that we're pushing, are not just addressing this crisis in the moment, but it's also addressing this long term. Like, we need to implement changes that don't just put Band-Aids, but, you know, reset the broken bone and fix this. So, excuse me, for example, Rhode Island is not a right to counsel state. Another reason why we have such a high eviction rate. Also, the gap between cost of housing and wages. I mean, our minimum wage is $10.50 an hour. And in order to afford a 2-bedroom rental, you have to be making at least $21 an hour. Excuse me, but there is also, we don't have any right to counsel protections. And so when folks go to eviction court, the landlords all have excellent attorneys who can argue their case strongly in front of a judge. But very, very, very few tenants who are defending their homes have that resource. So we don't have that, and it makes this, I mean, this is already an inherently skewed power dynamic, right? But making sure that in this process now, tenants have access to representation is really important. So through a lot of hard work and advocacy, we have established on Rhode Island a program called Safe Harbor Housing, which is essentially a mediation program. So this is a space where both landlords and tenants can come to the table and work out some kind of plan to avoid eviction. Now, are there a lot of holes in this? Yes. For example, both the landlord and the tenant have to agree to come to the table. So if you are a tenant and you say, yes, absolutely, I would love to participate in this. I want to find a way to be able to pay my rent. I just lost my job. I'm getting back on my feet. If your landlord says, give me my money, I don't really care. We've already talked about this enough. I'm not coming to another table. You're kind of stuck where you are. But it's a really, really important first step forward. And it's really what we have in the state. Since we don't have a moratorium, all federal protections have expired, and we're still waiting to see what's going to happen as a result of all of these current negotiations around the next stimulus package. Excuse me, but it's very clear that we need to keep pushing, and we need to keep advocating for the protections that will help folks in this moment. And number one, that is certainly advocating for another moratorium in Rhode Island, a true moratorium that is comprehensive and protects folks. So, excuse me, I wanted to share, the last thing I wanted to share is I was asked to speak a little bit about what are some of the important lessons that I've learned in my work and through our advocacy on the ground here in Rhode Island. So number one, I want to say coalitions matter. Like Rhode Island, since we are literally the smallest state in the country, you can get everybody statewide around the table. You could do that once a week. It's very easy. I mean, it can be very hard to coordinate, folks, like no matter what, if you're a nonprofit or policy, sometimes it can be like herding cats, but you can get us all together. And it's easy to make those, since we're 1 degree of separation from one another. If we are looking at an issue and we're saying, okay, we need to, what would really help us here, this is actually closely related to education outcomes. We need somebody who speaks to that or is doing this work to join us and advocate for this policy as well. It's very easy to reach out to somebody in education and say, hey, can you be at this table? They're probably already at the table to begin with. I encourage you in these to look at who is there really on your team and bring those folks to the table. Engaging people with in this work is really important, especially those with lived expertise. So the folks who are going through it. Nobody understands the failure of a policy or what needs to happen better. Nobody is a better expert than somebody who has had to be served by that policy or was not served by that policy, right? And also when you engage and when you center and you amplify and you make sure that the folks with lived expertise are leading all of these efforts, you will ensure that the policy that's made is not made in a vacuum. Because, I mean, when you're talking about folks that work in governor's offices or at our General Assembly, right? There are not very many people who truly understand what homelessness is or what it's like to be evicted. Not only have they likely never, ever even gotten close to being evicted, they probably don't even really know anyone who has gone through that type of experience. And so when you're trying to make that policy, you don't really, I mean, it's just all what's on paper. But when the folks who are, I mean, like when initially our moratorium was set to expire on the 18th, the courts were set to reopen on May 18th. But we did an enormous push to get folks, telling folks that this is happening and just urging people to call the governor and to share your story and to tell her what is going on, right? Because she's, like most governors, she's had daily or now weekly press conferences. And I'd hear her say on record, eviction isn't a big problem in Rhode Island. It's not a serious issue, which is absolutely false. Like completely, I have a lot of respect for our governor. And so when I heard that, I was just like, oh my goodness, like that is not the case. We need to change this. And so getting folks to call and to share their story and to really like paint the picture of what's happening is so important. Because like one thing that you can't necessarily get, like statistics are very important. They can anchor conversations. They can help people like conceptualize and get a handle on the issue. But there is a big difference between saying a very true and very terrifying statistic, like 75% of all Latinx households in Rhode Island are renters. And so therefore they are, not only were Latinx households being disproportionately impacted, being evicted at far higher rates than white Rhode Islanders, but you put that on top of a pandemic where Latinx households are also the ones losing income fastest, right? Because if you look at our state, what are our big industries? Tourism, hospitality, restaurants, all agriculture and aquaculture, right? So, I mean, all of these things come together. And when I speak to it as an advocate, I mean, I'm Latina, I am very proud to be Latina, but when I speak to it as an advocate, sometimes it can be a little easy to dismiss that. It is very hard, it is much harder, very hard for a policymaker, particularly an elected one, to dismiss someone who is not just advocating, but is living it. It is much harder to dismiss that statistic when a family is calling, when a mom is calling saying, we have 3 kids, my husband has a construction business, we've never had a problem paying our rent until now. Income has dried up because of this pandemic. My landlord not only tried to evict me during the pandemic, during this moratorium, they keep trying to evict me. They came to my house and tried to take the door off my hinges, which this is a true story. Much harder to say, I don't believe you, when that person is talking to you. And when it's not just that person, but it's that hundreds, even thousands of other folks sharing their story like that. That is so important. And I encourage you to always make that the center, the absolute cornerstone and foundation of your advocacy work here in trying to impact these policies. Excuse me. The other piece is sharp targeted focus. Right now, we are in a little bit, it can be a little challenging when you're trying to keep lots of policy plates up in the air. Like, we are dealing with this eviction issue, but also we're debating our state budget. And we are trying to advance all of those really important priorities, but also deal with this issue here. And it's like, well, we know the governor could issue an executive order. We know the legislature could make some action. What do we do? Having conversations to really outline what it is that your goals are, who your targets are, and how you're going, what's the path to connect with each target, right? Like having the conversation of like making a roadmap, identifying what change do you need, who can make that change happen, what's the path to get that change maker to do that, to implement that change that you want, and then who are all the people that could help you get there along the way. That's something that's really important to keep you sharp and tight and focused, because I mean, it is getting you off of your objective is another tool that folks can use to deflect the conversation and not be held accountable for their inaction or their bad action related to this. And then again, I want to close by going back to partnership matters, coalition matters. This is really hard work. It is not just a paycheck, right? Doing this with other folks is not just effective in getting more capacity to advance your goals, but also to help you, right? Like, this is tough. It's hard work, but it should never, ever be lonely work. And so you need allies. They're good for a lot of reasons, and you have them. You probably have more than you think. So make sure to engage with them and to work with them, because truly, united, the larger you are, the stronger you are, the more change you can impact. And that is a truly, truly powerful thing. So thank you very much. I hope I kept it to 10 minutes. I'm not super great with looking at the clock when I talk, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I also want to say thank you so much to all of you for the incredible work that you are doing in your communities. It makes such a huge difference. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Christina, and thanks, Renee. My name is Shannon Ray, and I am so glad to be here. I am the Stabilization Services and Hunger and Food Resources Director at Solid Ground. My pronouns are she, her. To start with, I'll tell you just a little bit about Solid Ground, and I'll try to move pretty quickly through this so we have time for questions. At Solid Ground, we believe that poverty is solvable. Our approach combines direct services with community-based advocacy, with the understanding that a stable home is a foundational part of ending poverty. We provide housing and homeless prevention in combination with services that meet basic needs to allow individuals and families to rebuild and thrive, including Broadview, our domestic violence shelter and transitional housing program. We also know that we serve many survivors of domestic and sexual violence across all our programs. Embedded in our mission is an anti-racism initiative, which is grounded in the recognition that communities of color disproportionately experience homelessness and poverty. And we strive to advocate for structural change and deliver focused services with staff who reflect the communities we serve. Together, we identify, learn, and connect the policies and systems that perpetuate poverty and racism in the lives of our program participants and our day-to-day work and advocate for change locally and statewide. I'm going to start with what we at Solid Ground have implemented in response to the pandemic. With both federal, state, and local moratoriums on eviction, we've served our community through tenant education, which helps community members understand and know their rights regarding the moratoriums and eviction. We also partner with the United Way of King County, Wellspring Family Services, and the Urban League of Seattle to provide rental assistance for those impacted by COVID-19. In fact, after only 2 days of the access portal being open, it had to be closed because of such high demand. Solid Ground alone received 1,700 applications for help, and we are working to help each household receive those funds. In other programs, including our low-income housing, households are also struggling to keep up with rent, and we are working closely with them to prevent housing loss. Our rapid rehousing participants need increased assistance with rent payments, and many of those have lost employment. We're also working with our funders and donors to extend the time that they can receive rental assistance. Our paratransit services experienced a reduction in ridership due to COVID-19, and so those pivoted quickly to support food delivery across the community. Food system support, in partnership with the Seattle Food Committee and City of Seattle, also pivoted with changes in food delivery, including the addition of food boxes and other bulk food purchases, and coordinating sanitation supply delivery to food banks. And our advocacy department has been identifying and supporting strategies for assistance and policy change with local, state, and national leaders. The Washington State moratorium has been extended through October 15th, but at some point we will still face that eviction cliff. The City of Seattle has additional protections for tenants, so it's important to seek guidance from a housing attorney to make sure you're getting specific information for the location that you're at. Prior to COVID-19, nearly 90% of renters with income below $20,000 were housing cost burden, as were nearly half of all renters. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the limitations of our affordable housing infrastructure and failures in the social safety net. And again, as others have spoken, the housing cost burden is about 30% or more of income on housing. In Seattle, 34.7% have been identified as housing burden as of April 2020. A lot more are, as again was mentioned earlier, are housing burden at a much higher level. Once the moratorium is lifted in Seattle, the King County Bar Association's Housing Justice Project is bracing for at least 1.5 times its usual case volume. And that's just those that know about the organization and know how to access it. According to the Housing Justice Project, eviction court is only going to get more inhospitable during the COVID-19 era, as fears of catching the disease and difficulties gaining access to Zoom-style remote court proceedings could cause no-shows and thus evictions to spike to new highs. As cited in the online publication, theappeal.org by Jay Willis on 7/14, Edmund Witter, the senior managing attorney at the Housing Justice Project, states the assembly line nature of evictions can catch tenants off guard. He says that most people don't realize that when they show up for their court date, it's going to be like Judge Judy. Judges rubber stamp many evictions at an initial show cause hearing, and the case never goes to trial. No time, no jury, no meaningful chance to make a case. You didn't know that all your rights were going to be decided on that day, and you weren't aware that you were supposed to bring in evidence, he said. You're just kind of at a loss. In Seattle, the Housing Justice Project found that tenants with counsel are more than 3 times as likely to avoid a forced eviction executed by the local sheriff's office and reach an out-of-court agreement with their landlord. When the agreement includes a payment plan for catching up on rent, tenants remain housed to nearly 2/3 of the time. Eviction may force survivors into homelessness or to return to abusers. And although in Washington, homelessness is not a sanctioned reason to take children away, try defending that in court against an abuser who has a home and money. The fear of eviction makes it even more likely that those living with the abuser will stay in order to remain housed. Because of systemic inequities and racism, we know that non-whites are less likely to have savings that can help them flee their abusers and seek help. We also know that wealthier whites are more likely to have access to attorneys, savings, and other supports to remain housed. For many wealthier survivors, this is also true. However, we also know that many survivors remain with abusers because they are unable to access the household resources that are under the control of the abuser. The disparities between people of color and whites becomes even more apparent in these times of crisis, and the lack of access to resources exacerbated by racism. I encourage you really to all advocate, again, as others have said, for continued funding to provide rental assistance, prevent evictions whenever possible, and to support those low-cost, low-barrier programs such as the Housing Justice Program in your communities to help prevent evictions. think I wanted to say a little bit more, but I'm also aware of the time and really want to make sure we leave at least some room for some questions. So I'm going to leave it at there, and again, say thank you so much for being here and for inviting me.
Thank you all so much for your expertise and time and really laying out what we're challenged and what we're facing with this potential eviction cliff that's looming in our states and communities across the nation. I just want to see if there are any questions in the chat box. We just have a few minutes left. There's always so much great content to cover and so much information we want to get out to the field, but I want to make sure to see if there's any questions that you all might have, or if I've missed anything. It looks like we're pretty good about responding in the chat box. Oh, go ahead, Sheena, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so we did have a couple of questions to come in that were captured, Debbie. So one of those questions came up during the time that Renee was actually speaking, and it was in regards to what qualifies as a rental. Does it apply to, I'm going to assume that means OVW/transitional housing. So if anyone could maybe just speak to that was on our presenters panel today.
Sure. This is Renee. So that's a really good question. And I assume you're talking about the federal moratorium, but I will just also say that at the state level, that definition of who's covered by a moratorium definitely differs. In terms of a really good rule to kind of a guidance rule is that if your client, if the type of housing that your client is in has VAWA protections, VAWA housing protections. So, you know, if it's COC, for example, housing, you know, if there is a VAWA housing protection component there, then it's covered by the CARES Act. So if you have specific questions or want to know if a specific type of housing is covered, please reach out. But a lot of federally funded housing is covered by the CARES Act. I hope, without going into specifics, I don't want to give you an incorrect response. So please reach out to me individually and we can talk more offline.
I also did want to do a quick plug, Renee. This is Debbie. If you are running a housing program, say like an OVW transitional housing program or a rapid rehousing program through HUD funding, you know, OVW transitional housing does not require that you take rent from people who are in your housing program. So if you have money to cover it within your grant, this would be a time to reconfigure your program or consider that, because families and survivors are struggling very much at this time. So you could look at restructuring. Sometimes people have tiered systems where people pay more the longer that they're in the OVW transitional housing program. This would be a time definitely to reconfigure or look at your rental requirements, and if they're really required to during this time, because people really need access to money and resources that are in our program. So you could take a look at that. And we definitely want you as programs and providers, if you are providing homelessness and housing programs, that we do all that we can to keep people housed. That we're not in the business of evictions. So even if someone cannot pay the rent and you have a rent systems in place, or people need to pay 30%, whatever policy you've instituted in your program that is not required by the federal project, we really want you to look at that, because we want people to stay housed during COVID no matter what.
And Debbie, I will just add to the McKinney-Vento homelessness programs are covered by VAWA, which means that, you know, the moratorium, those protections would apply. But as Debbie mentioned, it gets a little bit more complicated just in terms of like what the living arrangement and structure is. And that's why I didn't want to give sort of an absolute answer about, you know, because yeah, so please reach out and we can talk more. I just trying to stay away from making generalizations.
Thanks so much, Renee. And then in the interest of time, I'm going to pose one more question that came in. There were just a couple of questions that came in around legal assistance for survivors who may be facing eviction issues. Some resources were shared around that, and I'm sure we can get that out to attendees who were on the call. But one question that did come in was, what should an advocate do if a survivor still has their job and income, but has decided to, for many different reasons, stop paying their rent due to the eviction moratorium? Of course, you know, there's the encouragement to work with them to pay the rent, but is there any other advice that can be offered?
This is Renee. I'll jump in if, but others, the other panelists, please feel free to jump in as well. You know, I think it's really a case-by-case basis. You know, I do think, you know, it becomes really difficult because if folks have a lot of different reasons, you know, they may not be able to afford to pay rent. And so I guess one sort of overarching question is that decision to not pay, you know, related in any way to the abuse, to the violence? And if so, you know, their inability to pay, you know, there may be some, you know, if the situation is related, you know, directly related to DV, for example, there may be protections under state law. Like, for example, you might be able to get an early lease termination just depending on where you live. And if, you know, a survivor doesn't feel like they're safe living in their current unit. So again, it's a case-by-case basis. I also did share in the chat a list that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has put together about rental assistance programs at the state level, but obviously, you know, to what Christina was saying, like, you also want to think locally and, you know, definitely reach out to your networks and just try to learn more about any rental assistance programs that might be in place that might also be able to help.
And I'll just add a piece to that, Renee, also giving considerations in addition to the violence, thinking about, like you said, situation by situation basis, but also giving consideration to some survivors potentially being in multi-generational homes in addition to perhaps experiencing violence in those homes. And so how that may too can influence the decisions that are being made. So I think that is all of the questions that we have for the session. As you can see here, there is a brief survey that we ask for attendees to take, and that link can be found there, the Survey Monkey. And thank you all so much for joining today's session.